Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Graham Phipps. As chairman of the Jersey Climate Forum, I am honored to be opening this, our first informational presentation. Please note that this event is being videotaped, and please also make sure your phones are turned off. The Jersey Climate Forum was formed last year because of our concerns surrounding Jersey's carbon neutral policy and the likely economic impact of being a net zero island. Furthermore, we believe there has been insufficient evaluation concerning the future sourcing of Jersey's energy. Improving our understanding and learnings by bringing to Jersey expert speakers, plus promoting open debate on critical areas of climate change and energy options are key to us. Our mission statement clarifies our mandate and has been left on your chair. This can also be found on our website. Some people have called us climate deniers, but they have misunderstood our position. We all know and recognize that the world's climate changes and always has. The issue that requires debate, we feel, is what is causing these changes and what should we do about it. Although connected and a topic we plan to bring forward for further discussion and debate, this is not what tonight's event is about. Tonight, we are here to listen to the presentation, Lessons from Economic History: Can Wind and Solar Sustain a Modern Economy? By Dr. JohnConstable, which I hope you find of interest. We believe his findings should be taken into account in the selection of our island's future energy. Considering the best option for clean, cheap, and reliable energy is our focus today. Next month, the states of Jersey will be debating whether the island should approve, in principle, a wind farm to be built off our southwest coastline. This is a debate that will have far-reaching implications for our future, and we believe this needs further attention. We feel this subject has not been sufficiently researched and discussed, especially in the context of our island's needs. For decisions of this magnitude, we believe all viable sources of energy supply should be compared, contrasted, and debated before making any meaningful decisions. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have Dr. JohnConstable come to Jersey and share with us his research findings and present again tomorrow at to our state's members. You can see for yourself his extensive expertise by reviewing his bio that we have left you on your chair. However, for our video recording viewers, I would like to point out his excellent credentials, referring to his solid educational background, including degrees at Cambridge, his involvement with several energy and climate-related organizations, and his involvement with several UK parliamentary select committees and other international governments. Dr. JohnConstable is also a regular speaker on energy and climate-related matters at venues around the world and has published extensively on these subjects. There will be plenty of time for questions after his talk. So, for now, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation. And with great pleasure, please join me in welcoming Dr. JohnConstable.
Thank you very much, Graham. It's a real pleasure to be here, and my thanks to the Jersey Climate Forum for making that possible. I should apologise for appearing you déshabillé, but thanks to the tender mercies of a certain airline, I'm without a suit. So this is a collector's item. My first speech in Jersey and my first lecture without a suit in many, many decades. This is quite a complex talk, but I know you have momentous decisions coming up in relation to energy, and I wanted to give you a full set of concepts and principles with which you could start to think about those things. Why do I have to do it? Because so many of the points made, so much of the information available to you in the media is incorrect, either straightforwardly wrong or half-truths, dangerous half-truths. Things said to be happening are only happening locally when it needs to happen globally, or happening globally but not locally where it really matters. Much of the information you have about energy is simply incorrect, and you need to think more carefully about it. But also the concepts you have may not be adequate to help you understand the difficult decisions that now face us all. Because it's complex, I need to get your attention with some of the major topics that are animating my own thought on this matter. This is a chart of UK primary energy consumption between 1970 and 2022, the last year for which there is data. The first thing you can see in this chart is that it's declining. In fact, it's fallen by 28% since 2005. This is an astonishing fact, hardly debated in media or indeed even in professional circles. It's now at 1950s levels in spite of a rising population. This is quite remarkable. As you can see, yes, there's an industrial decline, but in fact all the other sectors are falling since 2005. 2005 is a magic year for this discussion because it's then that the climate policies began to become very expensive, saliently expensive to the economy. More on this topic. This is UK electricity consumption from 65 to 2022, down 22% since 2005. Again, this is an extraordinarily important fact. Electricity is an extremely sophisticated energy carrier. A healthy economy, one which is thriving, delivering increasing well-being to its people, would not exhibit this kind of trend. I shall come back to these charts. I'm giving you a preview of what's really worrying me about our current policies. Again, 2005 is the key number. And then I link those numbers with things such as this: stalling longevity improvement in the UK. This was the ONS report a few years ago. As you can see, there were small increases in male and female life expectancy at birth, 2015-16, and then it started to stall. You can see it actually in the plots there. Size of these increases was substantially smaller than those observed in the first decade of the 20th century. Something is happening to us. And it's not just in longevity, although it's pretty obvious in longevity. As the ONS says, the size of life expectancy gain between 13 and 18 is small by historical standards and in line with stalling improvements since 2011. There are many other indicators. Why is it that young women are deferring for so long their first birth? Because they don't find the society prosperous and promising. There are many other similar indicators which you could invoke, but I think this one is a really important and obviously statistically sound one. So let me give you an overview of the talk, having, I hope, indicated that I have a real pointed issue. Falling energy consumption is not a good thing in a modern economy. There's something wrong. I'm going to start off by thinking about energy and the theory of wealth. I'm basically a Cambridge academic, and so I tend to see things in very abstract terms. At least I want to understand the abstract terms before I proceed to count and to calculate. I'm going to think about energy and what it means to be a wealthy society. And I'm going to suggest to you that wealth is an improbable state of physics created by energy use. And I'm then going to describe the use of high-quality fuels. That's, for those of you who care about these things, low-entropy fuels, very high-quality ones, from the 13th to 20th centuries, showing population growth, immense growth in diversity of employment types, rising household wealth, ease of travel, and some other very important indicators. And then I'll home in on this falling energy consumption point, and I'll show you it's not just the UK, it's throughout the West. Most EU countries and the US is flatlining and threatening to go into similar sort of decline. And I'll contrast it with Asia, which is exhibiting a completely different pattern, one actually consistent with our own growth between the 13th and the 19th centuries. And I'm then going to ask what's causing that falling energy consumption in the West. And I'm going to tell you that it's the cost of our energy and climate policies, particularly the very high cost of renewables, both in terms of subsidy to the generators, but also the system management costs, leading to price rationing. We've got our industries are migrating to Northeast Asia, and our consumers at home are reducing their consumption because they can't afford to increase it. I'll talk about subsidy to renewables, income support, and also carbon pricing. And I'll home in on declining electricity sector productivity, a key indicator. I mean, economists understand very little about economies, but they do know that productivity is the key to success. If your productivity is falling, your costs are going to be increasing. And then I shall ask right at the end whether we've got an economically rational climate policy. And for the avoidance of doubt, I believe it is rational to have a climate policy, but your policy has to be rational, and ours simply isn't. I shall show you that the abatement cost, that's the cost of preventing the release of a ton of carbon dioxide, is actually higher than the social cost of carbon, which is an economist's estimate of the harm to human welfare caused by releasing that ton. In other words, the renewables cure is worse than the climate change disease. That's not rational. It's not sustainable. So well-meaning environmentalists need to recognize these facts, because this is putting current climate policy on a collision course with human well-being, and people will push back. There is a real risk that you lose the whole climate agenda because you have bet the farm on renewables. A different low-carbon agenda is required. And right at the end, I shall talk a little bit about offshore wind, operational costs and capital costs, because I know that's going to be a matter of interest to you. But back to the abstract and very general points. Energy and the theory of wealth. Well, here is a principle. Human societies are physical, thermodynamic, non-equilibrium systems. That means that they're very, very improbable. You stand in the middle of a town like this, and you look around you. It's a mass of physical states, all of them very, very improbable, but coordinated with your wishes. It's a lovely place to be. And that's true of all big cities. It's true even of small villages. Indeed, it's true even of very primitive societies. Even the simplest human societies are very improbable. So wealth is an improbable physical state serving a human requirement. The whole human sphere is a long way from thermodynamic equilibrium. You could shake the universe for a very long time before this convenient state of affairs fell out of it by chance. And I say, even the simplest societies are extraordinarily improbable. Bushmen in the Kalahari, they look simple to us, but actually, thermodynamically, very unlikely. So growth, economic growth, is an increase in improbability in coordination with our wishes. How is that improbability created, maintained? Maintaining it's very important, and further increased. Well, that's work. And as the physicists will tell you, to do work, you need energy. Indeed, energy, by definition, is the potential to do work. Energy conversions, doing work over time. Now that leads to a further reflection, too little dwelt upon even by professionals in this field. The quality of the fuel determines the structure and character of the human improbability generation systems that we call economies. Fuels are not to be confused with energy. Energy doesn't exist. It's an abstract property of fuels. Fuels are oil, coal, gas, the wind blowing if you want that, solar radiation. They have a property of being able to do work. They're energy state. The quality of that fuel determines what you can do in the economy. And fuel types vary a great deal in their thermodynamic quality. Wind energy is very low quality. It's close to random heat. No living organisms, absolutely none, use wind energy for their metabolic energy. Yes, birds glide on it. Some seeds are dispersed by it. But they don't use it for metabolic energy. Nature is astonishingly good at finding niches for life, but wind energy doesn't provide one. It's too close to equilibrium. It's too close to random heat. There's nothing there. The potential to do work is absent. Solar energy is low quality. It's a bit better than wind, and indeed there are creatures that use it for metabolic energy. But noble creatures though plants are, they are simple, and sensitives aside, they don't move very much. Biomass, plant material, wood, peat, food plants, it's medium quality, has low bulk density, you can only raise relatively modest temperatures with it. Fossil fuels, on the other hand, are very high quality indeed. How do they get that way? Well, partly because the material is organic, so these are complex states resulting from evolution by natural selection, but also, understated by many in discussions, it's resulting from gravitational forces causing very great pressures and high temperatures which change the chemical structure of this, making it still more improbable. So there is a sense in which a lot of the energy in fossil fuels is actually the result of gravity, stretched out over millions of years, causing an elevated energy state in the resulting material. It's very, very unlikely. Thinking about it in this way makes you realize just how special fossil fuels are energetically, and that makes you realize how difficult they're going to be to replace. And then there are nuclear sources. Well, they're extremely high quality, remains of the very low entropy, improbable state of the early universe. You could, if you were so inclined, say it's God's last best gift to mankind. Difficult to use, but possible. We can do it, and we're getting better at it. So this fuel quality matters enormously with the society that you could create with them. So high and low quality fuels result in different distributions of societal power, and we can see this in our history. So in pre-fossil economies, organic flows, plant harvests, wind and water, generate all the improbability, all the wealth. And wealth here has a very broad definition. Buildings, yes, but also brain states. It's everything in the human sphere. The energy sector, which is farming, is low productivity. It consumes most of its own output. And as a result, landowners dominate society, which is why you have the continuing romance of the European gentry and aristocracy, why people are still interested in watching Downton Abbey, because those people had more wealth and societal power than we can dream of today, because our distribution has changed dramatically, as I shall explain, due to fossil fuels. But in that sort of society, the non-land sector, the non-energy sector, is quite small and sociopolitically weak. And society is vulnerable. They can accumulate a little bit of wealth, they can maintain it, but it's fragile. A bad harvest, and they lose a lot of their societal complexity, a lot of their wealth. Fossil fuel economies are quite different. This is a high-quality fuel. It creates a very high-productivity energy sector. The fossil fuel sector consumes only a small fraction of its energy output, and the rest is left over for everybody else. And as a consequence, coal broke the power of landowners. It was the introduction of coal from the 16th to 19th century in Holland and England, through peat in Holland originally, and then coal with us, that displaced land from the energy sector, and creating the conditions for liberty. And the secondary and tertiary sectors, consumers and traders, now dominate society. It's the modern world. More importantly even than those, the economy is now very robust. It can withstand shocks, and growth is sustained. This is not an imaginary description, it's a real economy. This is England in the 13th to 20th centuries. So let's imagine it. Here is 16th century England. These are the organic energy flows. You can see the energy sector, which is land, dominates that little economy you've got there with the light blue areas, the non-energy sector. It's quite small. Let's add some coal. Everything has grown. Yes, the energy sector has grown, but the rest of the economy has grown even faster. This is 1700. And here we are with some more coal in 1850. Yes, the energy sector's grown again. It's now quite big in comparison to 1550. But look at the rest of the economy. This is an economy in which there are now many choices. A randomly born child in 1550 is going to end up working on the land. There are just very few other jobs. By 1700, they have more options. And by 1850, the world is their oyster. They can do almost anything they want. As I said, that's not an imaginary economy. That diagram I've just shown you is not literal data, it's schematic, but it is based on real data. Here is real data. This is English energy consumption between 1560 and 1859, drawn from work by Anthony Wrigley, book Energy in the English Industrial Revolution, which I commend to you. Anthony Wrigley died a couple of years ago. It's still a marvellous book. Highly recommended. This is my chart, however. There are no charts in Tony's book. Note, particularly, that coal was 50% of English energy consumption in 1700, long before what you've been told is the English Industrial Revolution. There is no Industrial Revolution. It's a fiction. This is a much longer process. It wasn't solely English, it wasn't solely industrial, and it wasn't a revolution in any meaningful sense of the word. It happened over a very long period, and until recently, it was still continuing. There is good reason to think that it may be stalling. Notice also that everything grows. So yes, coal grows hugely, that's the dark bar, but so does everything else, pretty much, with the exception of firewood, which tends to disappear in the 19th century. It's so much more economic to use coal. So the benefits of that growth in high-quality fuels in 1550 to 1900, these three societies, Britain, the Netherlands, and North America, and it happens almost simultaneously in all three, they move rapidly away from thermodynamic equilibrium, becoming vastly more complex than any other human society had been. Landowners lost political power, but coal owners did not replace them. So there were large gains in personal freedom in this period. This is the birth of liberty. It's not simply a change of heart or the passing of legislation. It's an energetics matter. The quality of the fuel broadened the human niche and made people free. You might want that to continue and think carefully about fuel choices in the future. A lot depends on the energy choices you make. We also see increasing industrial output, growing and urbanizing population, more diverse occupations, I've mentioned that already, transport networks, increasing household wealth, personal wealth, and even falling crime, declining death rate, and, of course, vast geopolitical power. I'll touch on all of these quite quickly. British industrial output. This is a standard chart drawn from Standard Economic History, Stephen Broadberry's British Economic Growth. It's indexed on 1700. It's on log scale because we'd need a much bigger building to get the chart in otherwise. You can see very rapid growth here, but also you can see major historical events. So the Black Death knocking the economy back in 1348. And then compound growth stabilizing in the late 1400s and beginning its steady and, until recently, uninterrupted growth curve. And of course, when people have wealth, they raise families because that's what human beings do. And so population grew as well. This chart, this is quinquennial data, very accurate, again from work by Tony Wrigley at Cambridge, shows population between 1541 and 1871. And you can see all sorts of interesting things in here. You can see perturbations in the curve due to plague. So when there are plagues, the population falters, particularly in that period because it's an organic economy still. So when there's a plague, they get knocked back. And when there are bad harvests, you can see perturbations in the pre-coal era. But notice, once there's coal in the fuel mix for Britain, a bad harvest, and indeed the 1795 to 1819 period, very extended period of bad harvests, amongst the worst in the historical record, doesn't affect population growth at all. By that time, the society was so rich, it could import food and trade. Other aspects of the population growth are urbanization. Urban centres are very important for informational exchange. They're informational hubs, as we now call them. So you can see the yellow bar is non-urban, the black is urban. So Britain was 6% urban in 1600, 24% urban in 1800. No society had been like this ever before. Remarkably high urbanization. And by comparison, you can see Europe was more urban in 1600, but significantly less urban by 1800. This was the major difference. Male occupational structure was transformed by the introduction of coal. You can see here the rising population, yes, but look at the people employed in the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. So the primary is agriculture and mining, secondary making stuff, clothing, footwear, and so on, tertiary dealers and sellers. So you can see that, yes, all right, the primary sector grows. We've seen that already in my schematics, but everything else grows faster. And of course, the tertiary sector grows enormously in this period, so much so and so distinctively that Bonaparte referred to us as a nation of shopkeepers. Correct, but he was incorrect to pick a fight with those shopkeepers. This is the same data, employment data, but analysed a little bit more closely. The colour scheme is the same. So the primary sector is the reddish bar, the greyish sector is the secondary sector, and the tertiary sector is the yellowish bars. What I want to draw your attention to here is the growth in the mining sector. You can see mining is almost invisible in 1710. It does grow in 1817 and 1851. But look how small it is in relation to the rest of the economy. That is how a healthy energy sector creates jobs. Not just jobs in the sector itself, it's the jobs it creates with the surplus and cheap energy that it sells to the rest of the economy. The question, therefore, is, would renewables do that for us today? I shall suggest to you the answer is no, and I'll show you why. I mentioned increasing national wealth. Well, I think you take that for granted when you see the growth figures you've already looked at. But have a look more carefully at this. Look at the growth in household wealth. It's not simply that the nation becomes richer, but individual families become richer. Everybody has more convenience in their lives. Do we want to put that into reverse? Well, it's an interesting question. In the 19th century, according to this data set, household wealth quadrupled in a period of 50 years. Now, I'm not saying the 19th century didn't have its problems, but it was a very remarkable period, a great period to be alive, probably one of the most attractive societies in the human record. Enormous opportunities for any randomly chosen child. And this is data relating to estates and their personal wealth. So you can see this is, in 1840, 17% of male deaths recorded estates over £100 and going up to 5,000, whereas in 1877, 31% of male deaths had estates of those sorts of scales. The really important thing here is to notice the growth in the middle class. Yes, there's a growth in the super rich. There were more of them. But it's the middle classes that really grew. The moneyed classes doubled in number, 4 times faster than the population. It was a great time to be alive. And there was even a fall in crime rate in the 19th century. You wouldn't have thought that, would you? I mean, you've all read Dickens, and you've seen modern productions of Dickens. You assume that it's a period of intense immiserization, rapacious crime. On the contrary, these are committals to magistrates' courts per 100,000 persons between 1840 and 1885. So you can see there was a declining rate of crime, 70% decline in committals per 100,000 persons over this period. They were so prosperous they didn't need to steal from one another, as one might say. And of course, people could go where they want. I've talked a lot so far about laissez-faire, people would be able to do what they wanted, but they also wanted laissez-passer, they could go where they wanted. This is the growth in railways. And here is a remarkable railway station painted by William Powell Frith in 1862. And as you can see here, miles of track and millions of passengers. People really were able to travel as never before, thanks to the presence of a highly productive energy sector, coal. And this is death rates per million per year by cause. People were getting healthier. Conditions not attributable to microorganisms, the black bar. Modern epidemiologists would probably beg to differ with this data set. I'm not responsible for the data, I've charted it. They would say a lot of that black bar actually is due to microorganisms, which were just not recognized as such at the time. So what we see here is improving health. So when you have a very remarkably improbable energy, or when you have a productive energy sector, you have a very improbable human sphere, you can clear it of pathogens. So your food supply becomes remarkably healthy. It's not likely that you're going to die just from buying something to eat on the street, as would be true in previous centuries. And I mentioned geopolitical power. It's one of the things that bothers people most at the moment when we are in a period of geopolitical stress, and you may see repeated calls for rearmament and refreshing our armed services. Well, it's a nice idea, but do we have the means to do it? In this period, the early 18th century, they did have the means to do it. That's a royal sovereign. It's 1701. It's thermodynamically a very, very improbable state of physics. And it was recognized at the time. This is a marvelous quotation from Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, a book I recommend to you. In bulk and weight, a warship is vastly superior to any other movable body of human invention, so there is no other that has an equal variety of differently surprising contrivances to boast of. Think of it physically. Again, it's just immensely improbable and very expensive to build. Very, very expensive. Also has extraordinarily high firepower. As Andrew Lambert notes, the firepower of this single ship had more firepower than the Russian army at the same time. One of these boats turns up outside your coastline capital city, you're in trouble. And it wasn't just the Navy which mattered at the time. This is evidence of the British economy's ability to project force, again, long before the classic Industrial Revolution. This is the Battle of Blenheim, or Blenheim, 1704. Highly significant battle, as I'm sure you know. British troops and allies defeated the greatest continental army at the time, France, and its ally, Bavaria. The armies were evenly matched, about 40,000 each, but Marlborough's victory was complete. The French suffered 70% losses, and Marshal Tallard and his staff were captured. It was a disaster for France. And indeed, some historians have even suggested that it's the long-term discredit on the monarchy which explains the revolution towards the end of the century. They never really recovered their prestige from this defeat. But what's really interesting about this is the logistic achievement of the British Army at this time. It was no ordinary battle. British forces hadn't been seen in Europe for 2 centuries. And now, suddenly, they were victorious 650 miles away in the heart of Europe. They're practically in Poland. 16,000 British troops collected, 24,000 allies en route. It's a 250-mile march from Bedburg to Blenheim, and it was conducted from 16th of May, 13th of August. So it's very rapid movement of soldiers and impeccable logistics, new boots for an entire army as they arrived in Bavaria. But, and this is perhaps the most important point of all about Marlborough's campaign, the army's provisions were paid for in cash at every stage. Their credit was so good. Only a very rich society can do this. And then they turned round and they marched home again. So high-quality fuels determine societal outcomes. Wealth broadens the human niche. It's more pleasant, there are more things to do. You live longer, your children live longer. And people become free. You can do as you wish and go as you wish. And great wealth reduces risk aversion. It creates the conditions for entrepreneurship and innovation. So freedom of that kind has an autocatalytic effect on the creation of yet more wealth. So economists have somehow got this back to front, or liberal economists have. They say that you need political freedom to create wealth. Well, not quite. You need wealth to create political freedom, which does then indeed create more wealth. You get a kind of positive feedback, an autocatalytic relation. The whole human sphere becomes still more improbable and indeed pleasant to inhabit. But, so much for the history. Let's suppose that contemporary policy mandates are telling us we should use low-quality fuels. You'll remember those are wind and solar. Organic flows, which we used to use. Well, what will happen? Well, at this point, I'm going to speculate. I don't know what's going to happen. But I don't think it'll be a simple reversal of the pattern I've shown you from the medieval period through to the present. It'll be a bit different. But let's see if we can imagine what it might be like. Here's our economy in 2000. Yes, the energy sector is quite substantial, but the rest of the economy is enormous. Let's add a lot of wind and solar. This is net zero by 2050. We know it's a low productivity energy sector, so it will have a much smaller energy margin. The rest of the economy is going to have to shrink. But we're going to subsidize the capital investments in renewables, so the energy sector will grow. It will suck in capital, actually, and indeed real-world capital, physical states. And so the energy sector will grow. It will employ more people at lower wages, by the way. But the fall in the rest of the economy is going to be quite significant, I suspect. Let's add a lot more. Well, at this point, I wonder whether actually we look at reproduction failure. The renewable sector is not productive. Will it actually produce enough energy to reproduce itself? Possibly not. What you see is that the energy sector will start to contract because it cannot maintain the complexity. Remember I said that we're improbable. Maintaining that improbability is one of the key features of a healthy economic system. And what comes next? Total system collapse? I don't know. But there is enough here in the plausible theory to make us averse to even attempting this experiment. It's too dangerous. Don't go down this route. You don't want to reverse the trend of adding low-quality fuels. Don't add low-quality fuels to a system which has risen out of high-quality fuels. You should have learned that lesson. But isn't that what we're actually doing? Well, yes. And there is evidence to suggest that our economies are already suffering. On the face of it, at global level, things look okay. This is total primary energy supply, data from the International Energy Agency, my chart. And you can see all renewables at the bottom, then coal, oil, natural gas, and at the top there's nuclear. You can see the oil shocks in the data. And you can see the 2008 financial crisis. It really was a crisis. And you can see COVID, and the world's economy is just beginning to pick up afterwards. So basically it looks okay. Oh, before I leave this slide, one of those misconceptions I mentioned, the energy transition. You will have heard a lot about the energy transition. There isn't one. All renewables are about 12.8% in 1971. They're about 14% in 2021. Almost unchanged, in spite of immense subsidy and coercion in the Western world. The UK alone is spending over £10 billion a year supporting renewables. Other countries spend much more. I'll give you data on that a little bit later. There is no energy transition at the global level. We are living, as you'll currently see, on this economy. This is China's total primary energy consumption since 1990. Most of that growth is accounted for by coal, natural gas, and oil, and much of it by coal. Indeed, our own prosperity is because we are borrowing money to buy goods from this economy, goods produced with fossil fuels and therefore cheap. Our politicians sometimes boast of the fact that our emissions have fallen dramatically since 1990. Well, they have, but that's because we've exported them to Northeast Asia, one of our most successful exports of recent decades. And you'll see, yes, they have a token wind and solar, and you'll read stories about how China is building enormous quantities of wind and so on and so forth. Yes, yes, true. But in a system this large, it's a drop in the bucket. It simply has no significance. They will dress the window. They're, after all, selling this stuff to us. We are their customers here. They're going to do a little bit to show willing. Their economy is fundamentally driven by fossil fuels. The engineer bureaucrats of Beijing are not fools. Our lawyers in Washington and Whitehall? But Europe is different. European energy consumption is falling. This is the EU 28, 1990 to 2019. And Germany's energy consumption is falling, 1990 to 2021. So people look at this and they'll say, look how much renewable energy they've added. Yes, that's true, they've added quite a lot, but remember it's cost them a great deal. And also recall that the dominant feature of this chart, if you're familiar with data, the dominant feature here is not the growth in the red band of wind, solar and so on, it's the fact that energy consumption is declining. That's what you really home in on here. And this is the UK chart that I showed you a little bit earlier. As I said, down 28% since 2005. And our electricity consumption, as I said, down 22% since the same year. Here's natural gas. I'm rather proud of this chart. It's a complete history of gas use, both town gas up to the 60s and then natural gas. And you can see the red line is our gas consumption in the UK, and it starts to drop very sharply in 2005. And so, indeed, does our production from the North Sea. But just to prove the point, it's across all energy sectors, down 22% since 2005. And just you're thinking about the sectors, say which bits of the British economy are using less energy. Well, up until about 2005, most of the decline was deindustrialization, perhaps for other reasons. Reasons other than climate policies. But most of the other sectors, that's to say domestic, transport and service economy, they were increasing. But after 2005, everything is declining. I think if you look at this and think of it as a biomedical trace, you say, this person is not well. They need to see a doctor. An exception to prove the rule. If you read the financial press carefully, you'll hear repeatedly that Poland is one of the most dynamic and impressive economies in the whole of Europe. It happens also to be the only economy that is still predominantly a fossil fuel economy, which seems to me to be an important data point. Fossil fuel consumption is actually increasing in Poland. The US, it's a complicated story. There are lots of things in the US energy chart to comment upon. One of them, I mention it in passing because I think it's so fascinating as an idea, is that there's a lot of lost growth in the US economy. If they stayed on trend from the early 70s, they should probably be using about twice as much energy as they currently are, and they'd be much more prosperous and perhaps happier with each other. Is that an extraordinary social friction that we now see in the US the result actually of internal poverty? They're just not as prosperous as they once were. But in any case, they have certainly been flatlining since 2005. You can probably read out the damage done by the Carter administration and then Reagan's reforms, returning the US to some sort of trend. But since about 2005, it's flatlining. I use these charts in my talks in the States because I'm trying to make them understand what's really going on. They are so proud of themselves they don't often think about this in detail. Even people in the energy sector do not. So these are American examples, indicative but very important. And important to us, of course, because we live underneath the American defense umbrella. This is energy consumption, electricity consumption, total electricity consumption by sector from 1990 to 2019. So the blue lines, that's the United States. The light one is the US other, and then US industry is the dark blue line. You can see that US industry is declining. And you'll see that both Chinese other and Chinese industry is increasing dramatically. Which of these two economies is healthy? Don't think it's very difficult to answer. One of them is troubled, and the other is roaring. Let's home in on industrial energy consumption, because obviously it's so important to the health of the nation state. This is US industrial energy consumption from 1990 to 2019. It's falling. Not dramatically, but it's falling. It's also de-electrifying. They're using less electricity than they were. And this is Chinese industrial energy consumption. These two charts are on the same scale. In 1990, the US was using more energy in industry. China is now using 4-5 times as much. And they are electrifying. Electricity is associated with very complex manufacturing processes. They're creating improbability on a dramatic scale. And of course, we're living on it, for the time being. Living on the kindness of strangers. So long as we can borrow money to buy these goods, we'll be in the market for them. That may not continue forever. Electricity is the key indicator here. It's sophistication. China is progressing, the US is regressing. Interestingly, I won't show you this data, but Europe is a little bit different. We're holding on to our sophisticated manufacturing a little bit better than the United States. But it's difficult. And you can see from the electricity chart I've shown you in relation to the UK that our total consumption is declining. All is not well. So, low entropy fuels create human well-being, strong nation-states, prosperous and good places to live. Low entropy fuels and their probable consequences are not likely to be pleasant to live with. So what's causing falling energy consumption? Well, the first thing to say is it's not energy efficiency. I know this is a common misconception. As I said, so many things that you believe, perhaps, turn out on close examination not to be true. Energy efficiency is simply not conservation. This has been known for a very long time. Energy, like cash, is never, ever left on the table. So Jevons, the great 19th century economist, pointed out that efficiency measures actually increase consumption. And they do this because efficiency reduces the cost of an energy conversion process, i.e. doing something, making something, moving something, lighting something. Therefore, the use of that service will increase because it's now cheaper, up to the temporary elastic limit of that demand for that service. At that point, you have energy left over to do things. And that residual energy is transferred to a human requirement that has been previously unmet human need. And there's no principled limit to the changes we will make to the world to serve our ends. So energy demand rises. Nobody is ever going to say that child mortality is low enough. Why should they? Therefore, falling energy consumption in the West has other explanations. And I'm going to tell you that it's the forced introduction of inferior costly fuels, high entropy wind and solar, and penalties, carbon taxation, on superior low entropy fossil fuels, nuclear, causing high costs. And believe it or not, we do actually put a carbon tax on nuclear. Gordon Brown did that. I often wondered why. These high costs are causing what economists refer to as price rationing. People are not using as much energy because they can't afford to. So here are a series of charts from a book of mine, Europe's Green Experiment. You can download it from the GWPF website at no charge. This data is European Union data, recharted to make it a little bit easier to see. And so these are electricity prices in the EU and the G20 between 2008 and 2019. So the red line at the top is EU household prices in euros per megawatt hour, 2018 euros for economists in the audience. And as you can see, EU household prices are way above G20 household prices. You'll notice also that G20 industry prices are very considerably lower than EU industry prices. But here's the clinching point. EU and G20 wholesale prices are nearly the same. So the difference between the wholesale and the retail prices is explained by policies. And of course, they happen to be energy and climate policies. The same is true for natural gas prices. I won't dig into this chart in detail. You'll be able to look at it in some detail if you want, but exactly the same point can be made, and indeed so can it be made in relation to transport fuels. Energy is just very much more expensive in the EU due to policies than in the G20. The scale of those impositions, those policies, is very large. This is the emissions trading scheme, again from my 2022 book, Europe's Green Experiment. So the total cost of emissions trading to the European economy was about 80 billion US dollars between 2013 and 2021. Broken down by country for those of you who are interested in it, you can see that the major industrial powers were very badly affected by it. About 20 billion a year at present. It's a non-trivial imposition on European businesses. But in addition to that, there are also energy subsidies, income support subsidies to generators. So the green bar here are subsidies to renewable generators. The renewables total is about 800 billion US dollars. I'm sorry that they're in US dollars. I often talk to American audiences, and so I tend to think in them now. Current annual cost is about 70 billion US dollars. This cannot go on. When you're in competition with manufacturers in Northeast Asia who do not have these kinds of penalties, you're not going to be able to sell easily internationally. At some point, this will have to go. And we are, in Europe, if I can use that we for once, we're responsible for most of these subsidies globally. So the EU accounts for the bulk of global subsidies. You can see the blue bars, that's the European Union. The other countries, China is the little blue bit at the top, USA is the yellow, UK is the grey, because I disaggregate it for this purpose, wasn't in the European Union for those periods. And then Japan tried fairly hard too, but most of it's European. The errors in climate policy are fundamentally European errors. The rest of the world, not so interested, actually. So the effects of these subsidies have been enormous on European electricity supply. There has been a major expansion in renewable capacity, really significant growth, and a very large capex. Even in the UK, a relatively small part of the European system, as it were, it's about £200 billion in the decade 2010 to 2022. The opportunity cost of that is enormous. I mean, what could you have spent that money on in the power sector or in some other sector? And there has been a really big, significant decline in thermal capacity, both combustion and nuclear, but a very large total increase in capacity because there's so much wind and solar going onto the system. But as I've shown you, demand for electricity is falling. So you've got more capacity, falling demand, and therefore, obviously, a less productive system. Collapsing productivity will further increase costs. So there's strong negative feedback building up in the electricity system in Europe, and the deprecated thermal capacity is coming off the system because nobody wants to invest in it, but it's still essential to guarantee security of supply. So we have a paradox. We depend on the residual fossil fuel generators, but nobody wants to invest in them because we've distorted the markets so heavily with subsidies to wind and solar. And unfortunately, in return for this, as I will come to in my last few slides, there's no evidence in the audited financial statements that all this subsidy has reduced the cost of wind and solar. And recurring to my initial physical points, there's no reason to expect that it would, actually. So this is growth in electricity capacity. And when you spend that much money on subsidy, yes, you're going to get a gross effect. The gross benefit will be positive. So this is the growth in renewables. As you can see, about 100 gigawatts in 1990, 500 gigawatts in 2020. Huge growth. Investors piled into this because it had been completely de-risked at the expense of consumers. Very, very expensive to consumers, as I've shown you. And this is electricity generation capacity by member state, 1990 to 2020. I've labelled the countries that perhaps matter most to you, Germany in blue, France in brown, and the UK in yellow. So Germany's expansion is largely explained by wind and solar. But thermal capacity, which is the reliable generation that guarantees security of supply because it's there when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, that's actually been declining, both in combustion fuel capacity and in nuclear. You can even see it in the French curve, actually. That second chart is, if you're a serious environmentalist, something to make your hair stand on end. Nuclear offers the best long-term option for prosperous, low-carbon societies, and yet our capacities are declining. Northeast Asia is different, of course. So this is another chart from my book about productivity of the sector. So I said, we've got more capacity, but it's not very productive capacity. It's wind and solar. And our demand is falling. So that's another factor reducing productivity. In 2002, 55% productivity ratio. At present, it's about 37%. That's a catastrophic decline. Any business exhibiting this kind of collapse in productivity would be calling in the management consultants to find out what was wrong. Well, we know what was wrong. We distorted our energy sector. So here we are again. Are we actually seeing this? I suggest yes, we're beginning to see the beginnings of the second panel here. We're seeing a growth in the energy sector and a decline in the non-energy economy around it. I don't think this is fiction now. I think this first panel is probably right. That's how it's going to be. What comes next, I don't know. I'm still speculating about that. I just don't want to go there. We must avoid that experiment. We're beginning to see the incipient decay that is predicted from theory. We must turn this around. Otherwise, we shall end up with a very dirty economy, and environmentalists shouldn't want that. Now, at this point, you may say to yourselves, well, okay, but climate change is such a serious problem, we just have to do this and hope that Asia agrees with us eventually. Is it economically rational? And perhaps all that subsidy has actually produced reductions in the cost for wind and solar. Because after all, the newspapers are always telling us that that's true. Well, we can quite easily do a calculation to look at the economic rationality of the climate policies. We can say to ourselves, what's the abatement cost? That's the cost of preventing the release of a ton of carbon dioxide. And economists have a way of doing that. It's quite straightforward, actually, very easy. And they have another number called the social cost of carbon, which is the cost to human welfare, net present value and all that, of releasing that ton of carbon dioxide. So it's the harm to human welfare. So you can say the abatement cost is the cure, and social cost of carbon is the disease. Well, most models reckon the disease is about $50 a tonne. Some a bit more, some a bit less. Most models in that sort of region. If the abatement cost is greater than the social cost of carbon, then the cure is worse than the disease, and no rational economy would do that. That would be silly. But it's what we're doing. This chart is from European Union data, processed by Hannison in an article for 2019, and it shows the abatement cost in yellow and brown as opposed to the social cost, which is represented by the blue lines here. So the cure is worse than the disease in nearly all cases. It is economically irrational to do this. Again, sincere environmentalists should be very alarmed by this chart because it means the policies are on a collision course with human welfare. And that is a collision that the policies will not win. If you want a sustainable economy, you cannot keep forcing these kinds of abatement costs onto the economies. No wonder you get pushback. But what about cost reductions for wind and solar? You'll read repeatedly that the costs have come down dramatically. Well, I was suspicious about that on physical grounds. And so I worked with and commissioned an econometrist at the University of Edinburgh, Gordon Hughes, former World Bank economist, actually, in case that matters to you, to look at the audited financial statements of wind farm companies. And he did. Looked at 350 to 400 companies and winkled out data relating to their capital costs and their operational costs. As you remember, there was great growth in wind. You see that light blue section of the chart. That's the growth in wind. So we'll index capital cost against that growth because you think learning by doing. The more they have, surely they're going to learn how to do it more cheaply. Well, this chart suggests that there isn't a very significant reduction at all. So this is across the horizontal axis is cumulative installed capacity in Europe in gigawatts, going up to many gigawatts. And you'll see that actually over time it's increasing. And it's been flatlining recently, but no significant decline. It is still very, very expensive around about £4 million a megawatt. For reference, a combined cycle gas turbine is somewhere between 500,000 and a million. So it's expensive to build, meaning that to give a rate of return to capital investors, consumers are going to have to pay above average rates. But even more interestingly, what Professor Hughes found was that operational costs rose quite significantly over time. And that's important because the income and the operational costs have to be in the right relationship. If the OPEX is higher than the income, then it's not worth continuing, and you're underwater. What he discovered was that shallow water sites show an increase in operational cost over time, but most importantly, the deep water sites show a very significant rise in OPEX as these sites age. Interesting, because the business model for many of these development projects is that the offshore wind farm is sold on to an unsuspecting ultimate owner, a pension fund or something like that. So early on, the increase in OPEX is not very dramatic and it's covered by warranties anyway. Later on, the OPEX starts to climb very sharply. From a strategic perspective, that means the capital refreshment cycle is much shorter than people have anticipated. They become uneconomic long before their engineering lifetimes expire. Perhaps an interesting reflection for an island that might be faced with owning or having one of these large, depending on one of these large offshore wind farms. What we find here is that offshore wind OPEX is high and it appears to be on a rising trend. The economic lifetime is shorter than the engineering lifetime. This was quite surprising to many in the sector. I suppose Gordon and I weren't that surprised, but then we understand the physics of these things. So, in conclusion, high-quality fuels created the rich and free societies that we enjoy today. Renewables are low-quality fuels, and there is no reason in theory and every reason in practical empirical evidence to suppose that they cannot sustain those societies. We're seeing the forced use of renewables causing highly significant lost growth and declines in energy consumption in the West. I think there's also evidence of societal decline. I hope that's not just pessimism on my part. At least I hope it is pessimism on my part. But I think there's a lot of evidence that in fact we are seeing the regression towards equilibrium and to disorder and chaos that I observe. But to be more optimistic, it is not too late to change course. And we should change course. We should change course because human welfare matters. I have 3 children. I don't want them growing up in a medieval society, an increasingly medieval society. And we should do it because it is rational to have a climate policy. But this climate policy is irrational and is going to fail, and is failing. Do we really want a distressed return to coal? Well, there's a choice for you. Thank you very much. You've been very patient.